Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Safari Mack special, where I'll be your guide and host, helping you make connections to the wild. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining me from Killer Whales Part 1, congratulations, because today we're in for a little bit of a special treat. But if there are those that are joining me for the very first time and have not seen Killer Whales Part 1 just yet, what I would like to invite you to do is first go and watch Killer Whales Part 1 and then come back for this special, okay? Alright. Today we are going to be looking at killer whales. But wait a minute. If you've joined me this morning with Killer Whales Part 1, we were talking about a kind of killer whale called the Southern Resident Orca. Now, you're probably wondering, what do I mean by resident? Now, of course, yeah, the resident really is the same thing as like us living in the same area. But there's actually, believe it or not, there's actually differences. There are major, major differences. See, in Killer Whales Part 1, I explained to you that despite being found all over the world, killer whales are a lot similar to you and me. For we all come from different backgrounds, we have different dialects, and we even have different nationalities, even different ways of how we do things, our culture, our way of life. Same for orcas. So one way that you could look at these different ecotypes, think of it as how we humans think of our own different nationalities. There's Americans, there's Europeans, Africans, Asians, you know, basically that kind of same idea. So we're going to use that, and I want to invite you to keep that part in mind as we take a look at some of these different orca ecotypes so that we can learn more about how this incredible species comes to dominate the oceans and earn the name of the wolves of the sea. But just so you know, for today we're going to specifically focus on these three different kinds that are living up in the Northern Hemisphere of the Pacific Ocean. Now, there are different kinds all over the world, but we'll get to them at a much later time as we continue our worldly travels. So for starters, let's do a little recap of the resident orca. So our topic orca from Killer Whales Part 1 is the Southern Resident Orca. Now, these creatures have very different ways of how they live. For starters, just like other orcas or this orca ecotypes, they live in family groups that are called pods, and these pods are mostly consisted of a family unit, which is an elderly matriarch, or who you could probably call your great-great-great-grandmother, and then all the others are her descendants. These are her daughters, her granddaughters, her grandsons, her sons, and even her relatives. So maybe the eldest female has somewhat of a baby brother. It can happen, or something like that. Either way, these family units live all their lives together. They never really leave one another. So yeah, if you want to make fun of these orcas for being a mama's boy, go ahead. But I don't know that mama's going to really appreciate that. But now, despite the name of killer whale, we know that they eat many different animals, right? Thankfully not people, but they eat fish, porpoises, squid, birds, even sharks. Not these guys. These guys live exclusively off of fish. And if you have seen Part 1, then you'll know exactly one of the main types of fish that they love to dine on. And you'll understand why it affects them in next week's Part 2 episode. Similar to orca. Now, a little bit of a difference between these other ecotypes. Take a look at this is a female orca with her calf. Take a look at her dorsal fin. As you can see, as it gets closer towards the top, it starts to have a bit of a little curve. And then a lesser known difference between other orca ecotypes is that resident orcas actually have this kind of saddle patch that has a little extra color in between the gray area. And you can see it right here. There's a little bit of a kind of like a gap in between, right? Like somebody accidentally painted on them. And in terms of their size, these are considered to be second place of from biggest to smallest. So these are like the medium-sized orcas. And because of where they go and because of where they hang out most of the time, they are considered to be one of the most studied of all orca ecotypes. So a big win for this subspecies. The next type is the transient. The transient is named after this guy, Michael Biggs, who was the orca superstar, you could say, that would eventually help us to identify these different subspecies all over the world as ecotypes. And so, thanks to this, and thanks to his hard work, he has been honored by having his last name be part of this orca's ecotype. So you can call them transients or Biggs orcas. Now, these orcas, though, are major different. Now, the resident orcas family group can be big, but with their population right now, they are unfortunately a little bit reduced. These guys are even more reduced. In fact, usually a pod might be made of around 3 to 7 individuals. I know, hardly enough of a family, but very, very tight. Another major difference between transients and the residents, these are the top marine mammal predators. They eat porpoises, sea lions, seals, and more. Another major difference, which you probably didn't know, unlike the resident orcas that communicate to each other a lot, these guys don't really sing too much, or they don't really communicate as much. Why is that? That's because these orcas are all about trying to use as much of the element of surprise when it comes to attacking their prey, which are marine mammals. See, orcas have to rely on communication, but so do other marine mammals. So in order to surprise their prey, they have to stop calling and keep as silent as possible. Because speed, stamina, and stealth and tactics are everything. Finally, if you're looking for the biggest kind, this is it. These orcas take the top of being the biggest of the ecotypes of the Northern Hemisphere. Finally, I'm afraid we have to end this special, with the subspecies that seems to end us on a little bit of an anticlimactic note. That's because these are called offshore orcas. But what makes them anticlimactic? Unfortunately, not too much is actually known about these animals. In fact, when they were discovered in 1988 by a humpback whale researcher, it was considered to be pure luck that they even found this third ecotype at all. Now these orcas, subspecies that I've mentioned, the transients and the residents, and including these offshore orcas, they do share somewhat of the same habitat, but they do not interbreed with one another. So there's no getting an offshore getting with a resident or a transient. That's just not possible. That's because these guys are truly genetically distinct, very genetically distinct, and offshore orcas are absolutely no exceptions. In fact, a major difference between them and these guys, while they also feed on schooling fish, these guys are known to, thankfully from research that has been gathered, and like I said, this is based on pure luck, they were actually able to discover that this kind of white orca actually will eat sharks. And from dissecting dead orcas that they found, they discovered that their teeth have been worn because of the shark's tough skin. So these orcas' teeth are often worn down more than the other species combined. Finally, these guys are not exactly the most known, but more research is needed to be done to discover more about these animals. So I'm afraid that's all the time I have for today's special. And as we go throughout the world, we'll learn more about different ecotypes. But for today, I'd like to just thank you all for taking the time to join me. And I'd like to also remind you and invite you to join me for next week's part 2 of Killer Whales. But until then, this is Safari Mack, and I'll see you all out there.